Okay, so like imagine this. You're on a train, right? And it's going through these like amazing landscapes.
Yeah.
The world's just flying by, and you're feeling pretty good about it because hey, trains are good for the environment, right? At least that's what we always hear.
Right, the romance of the rails.
Totally. But is it all it's cracked up to be? Today we're taking a deep dive into the world of railways and how they really impact the environment.
And we're not just talking about vibes here. We're going straight to the source with this document called 22 Environmental Effects of Railways. It's got all the data.
Or we're talking numbers comparisons, the whole 9 yards. We'll find out how much energy goes into getting you from point A to point B, how those CO2 emissions stack up against other ways to travel.
We'll even touch on some of the not so pleasant sounds that trains can create.
Because, let's be real, it's not always the most peaceful journey.
Exactly. And this all ties into the bigger picture of climate change and the idea of sustainable development. Basically, how do we make choices today that don't leave future generations dealing with a whole mess of problems?
Right. It's like if rising sea levels were train tracks, we'd be on a runaway train right now. And we humans, we've definitely played a part in laying those tracks with our ever-growing carbon footprint.
And the data's right there. It's impossible to ignore. We see global temperatures rising, Arctic sea ice shrinking. These aren't just numbers on a graph. They're warning signs that we need to change course and fast.
So where do railways fit into all of this? Are they the express train to a greener future or just another passenger on the problem train?
Let's break it down. One of the first things we need to consider is just how much space different modes of transportation take up.
Yeah, because urban sprawl is a real thing. Cities just seem to keep sprawling outwards with more concrete and asphalt.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. The data tells us that a single car passenger takes up 22 times more space than someone on a train.
Wait, 22 times? That's wild. It's like comparing a suitcase to one of those giant shipping containers. Are you saying one car takes up the same amount of space as a whole train car packed with people?
It really puts things into perspective, right? Especially when you think about what it takes to build and maintain all that infrastructure for cars. We're not just talking about the roads themselves, but the impact on ecosystems, water drainage, even the air we breathe. Railways, on the other hand, they use land much more efficiently, especially when you consider how many people they can transport.
That's a really good point. And it's
Yeah.
not just about the space on the ground either, right? We also have to think about the energy it takes to actually move all those vehicles.
You're spot on. And speaking of energy, let's talk about electric cars for a second. Everyone's talking about them like they're the superheroes of the eco-friendly future.
Totally. Zero emissions is like the biggest buzzword in car commercials these days.
And listen, I'm not saying they're a bad thing. They're definitely a step in the right direction. But here's something interesting from our source. Back in 2009, railways in the EU were already running a larger portion of their operations on electricity compared to diesel. They were ahead of the game.
Really? So while we were all still trying to figure out what a hybrid car was, trains were already quietly cruising along on electric power.
Hmm.
That's pretty cool, actually. Sounds like they've had a head start on reducing those emissions.
For sure. And the fact that they adopted electric technology early on really shows their commitment to being more energy efficient.
So how do we even measure energy efficiency when we're comparing different ways of getting around? It can't just be about how much electricity something uses, right?
You've hit the nail on the head. We need a way to compare apples to apples, or in this case, trains to planes to automobiles. That's where the concept of specific energy consumption comes in. Basically, it tells you how much energy it takes to move one passenger that's used a certain distance.
Okay, so it's not just about the total energy used, but how efficiently that energy is actually used to move people.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So where do railways stand when we look at this specific energy consumption thing?
They consistently come out on top. Trains are more efficient than both cars and planes in this area. Think about it. With a train, you're moving tons of people with a single engine. Compare that to a whole bunch of individual cars all burning fuel.
Okay, so far it seems like railways are scoring some major points for being good for the environment. But what about those CO2 emissions everyone's always worried about?
The million-dollar question, right? Transportation is a huge contributor to global CO2 emissions, but this is another area where railways have a surprisingly positive story to tell.
Seriously, even compared to flying. Because we all know that hopping on a plane comes with a pretty hefty carbon footprint.
You're absolutely right. But check this out. When you look at the numbers, trains release way fewer CO2 emissions per passenger kilometer than airplanes. To put it simply, choosing a train over a plane for your next trip could make a real difference in reducing your own carbon footprint.
Wow, that's actually huge. This is making me rethink my travel plans for next summer, for sure. But before we go too far down the track of praising train travel, I have a feeling there might be some downsides too. No mode of transportation is perfect after all.
You got that right. While railways seem to be on the right path when it comes to sustainability, there's still some bumps along the way.
Okay, so let's talk about that one thing that can really put a damper on a relaxing train trip, the noise. What's the deal with all the noise pollution from railways?
Yeah, it's not exactly what you'd call easy listening, is it?
Right, not exactly.
And it's not just one type of noise either. It's like this whole symphony of sounds. You've got the engines themselves, especially those older diesel ones, just rumbling away.
Yeah.
Then you've got the wheels on the tracks making that rhythmic clatter, which gets even louder the faster the train goes.
It's like the soundtrack to a chase scene.
And on top of all that, you've got the whooshing sound of the train cutting through the air at high speed. It's all about aerodynamics.
It's like a whole orchestra of industrial sounds. I've totally had that experience where a train goes by and it feels like my whole body is vibrating. So is there anything they can do to like muffle these noisy orchestras on rails?
Quiet them down a bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Railways have actually been working on this for a while now. One of the most common things you'll see along train tracks are those big noise barriers.
Oh yeah, those huge walls.
Yeah.
I've always wondered how effective those things actually are. Are they just for looks or do they actually absorb the sound?
They actually make a big difference. Think of it this way. They're creating what's called a sound shadow, basically blocking the path of those sound waves from the train to your ears.
Oh, interesting.
And they design those barriers strategically, too. Some are made with materials that absorb the sound, while others are angled in a way that deflects it upwards and away from where people are. It's actually quite clever.
That's pretty cool. So it's like using physics to manipulate sound. What about the tracks themselves, though? Can they do anything to make those steel rails a little less clink-clankety?
You're on the right track.
I had to.
Railways use something called track grinding, which is basically like giving the tracks a spa treatment.
I love that.
They use special machines to smooth out any imperfections on the surface of the rails, which then reduces those vibrations and that impact noise you hear when the train rolls over them.
It's amazing how much work goes into reducing all that noise we kind of just tune out in our daily lives. It's like they're constantly trying to refine how the train interacts with the environment around it. But let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about another thing that comes up with railways. The whole issue of transporting hazardous materials.
Right, that's definitely something we need to consider. While accidents involving hazardous materials are statistically less common with railways compared to other forms of transportation, they do still happen.
Exactly. And when they do, the consequences can be really serious.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've all seen those news stories. It's a good reminder that even when we're talking about eco-friendly ways to move things around, safety has to be the top priority.
For sure.
So what are they doing to prevent these kinds of accidents from happening in the first place?
Well, it's a multi-layered approach. First and foremost, there are very strict rules about the types of containers that can be used to transport hazardous materials. And we're not talking about your average shipping containers here. These are heavy-duty containers that are specifically designed to withstand impact punctures, even fire to a certain extent.
Wow.
It's like they're designed to be these little fortresses for dangerous substances.
Yeah, like little mobile safety bunkers.
Exactly. But it's not just about the containers themselves. There are also really detailed procedures for how these materials are loaded and secured during transport, and even how the trains carrying them are operated.
I imagine there are whole teams of people dedicated to making sure everything is done by the book.
Oh, absolutely. Railways have dedicated teams who are responsible for ensuring that all safety regulations are being met and that these materials are handled with extreme care every step of the way.
That makes sense. It's good to know they're taking it so seriously. And I bet technology plays a big role in all of this too, right?
Oh, for sure. Railways are using more and more sophisticated tracking systems these days.
To keep tabs on everything.
Exactly. These systems can monitor things like the train's location, its speed, even its condition, all in real time. And this is all for trains carrying hazardous materials.
So it's like having a watchful eye on these trains 24/7, making sure they stay on track, both literally and figuratively.
Exactly. And these systems are really important because they can actually help prevent accidents from happening in the first place. They can detect if something seems off and allow for intervention before it becomes a problem. And if an incident does occur, these systems enable a much faster response time, which can be crucial in those situations.
It's really interesting how technology is being used to improve safety, in an industry that's been around for so long.
Yeah, it speaks to how much things have evolved.
It really highlights that we're always trying to strike that balance, finding transportation solutions that are good for the planet, but also prioritize the safety of people and communities.
That's the key right there, about recognizing that no system is perfect, but we can always strive to minimize risks and maximize safety while still working towards a more sustainable future.
So we've really gone deep into the world of railways, haven't we?
We have.
We've seen those eco-friendly wins, and we've talked about some of the challenges that still need to be addressed. It's like we've been on this journey right alongside those trains, seeing how they impact the environment as they travel.
It's about seeing those train tracks not just as a way to get from one place to another, but as a path towards a future where we've managed to separate transportation from environmental damage.
It's like we've been given this map, this roadmap to a more sustainable future, and sometimes the best route is the one that follows those steel rails.
Well said. And remember, the more we understand about how our choices impact the environment, the better equipped we are to make decisions that steer us towards a destination we can all feel good about.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect. It's about making conscious choices, those small steps that might seem insignificant on their own.
Right. But when enough people make those choices, they add up and they can create a real wave of change.
Exactly. And it's not just about the individual trips we take either, right?
Yeah.
We can use our voices to advocate for things like better rail infrastructure policies that encourage train travel investments, that make railways even more sustainable. It's about working towards a system that makes it easier for everyone to choose the greener option. You know what? This whole conversation has really changed my perspective. I used to think of train travel as this kind of charming, maybe even a little old-fashioned way to get around.
Right.
But now I see it as a powerful tool in the fight against climate change.
It's a shift in how we think, isn't it?
It really is. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of the line for today's journey.
I think so.
I don't know about you, but I'm feeling inspired to hop on a train and see the world in a new light.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of railways and their environmental impact. We'll be back next time to unearth more insights that matter.